Good day, everybody. Welcome to another Live with Kevin. So very glad that you're here, wherever you are, wherever here is for you. And in fact, I'd love to know where here is for you. So on whatever social channel you're on right now, platform you're on, I hope that you'll just go into the comments and type in where you're from, because I would love to know that and maybe acknowledge that on the show as well. But I have two reasons for asking you to do that. One is I'm curious where you're located and I want to be able to say hello to you. But the other reason that I want you to do that is I really hope that you will interact with us throughout the course of this show, right? Like, think about it this way. If we were sitting around the table having a conversation, you and I and my guest, and you wouldn't just sit there and say nothing. If you had a question, you'd ask it, right? If you had a comment, you'd share it. If you had an idea, you would offer it. Why wouldn't you then do that here? That's what I want you to do. So tell us where you're from. And then as we go along, if you have questions and thoughts and ideas, share them. If you do that, this will be a better conversation, a more interesting conversation, and it will certainly be better for you because you'll hopefully get your question answered. And all of that will then eventually make this a better podcast. And so if you didn't know that this will eventually be a podcast, if you look over my shoulder, you can see that it says Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So in this particular case, in the middle of May, this will be released on our podcast channel. And you can find all about that, past episodes, etc., by going to remarkablepodcast.com. So what I'm going to do now, though, is transition us from welcoming you to being here live or watching later to the podcast itself, where we will start the recording for that. So Marissa, this is for you in 3, 2, 1. Biases. We all have them. And the more we are aware of them, the less negative impact they will have on our behavior and performance. But what are the biggest biases for us as leaders? And how can we be both more aware of them and better equipped to work with them? Well, those are the questions we're exploring today. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively, make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. It's a pretty cool thing to do that I get to do, and I'm glad that you're here with me. If you are listening to this podcast in the future, you could be with us live. There are people with us live, and you could be watching it rather than listening, which you might be doing. And so if you want to find out when and how that's happening, you can sign up for our Facebook or LinkedIn groups to get all that information, pertinent information. You can go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to get all that inside scoop, and then hopefully join us in the future. Today's episode is brought to you by our Remarkable Master Classes. Pick from 13 important life and leadership skills to help you become a more effective, productive, and confident leader while overcoming some of your toughest challenges. You can learn more and sign up at remarkablemasterclass.com. And now, without further ado, I'm going to bring in our guest. I'm going to add her to the screen, and I'm going to introduce her to you, and we're going to dive in. My guest today is Lisa Tromba. She is a seasoned executive expert in executive search and leadership solutions. She's the founder of Lisa Tromba Associates and Leadership Intelligence Services. Her career spans notable roles at global firms like Odgers Berndsen and A.T. Kearney, and she brings a wealth of experience from her time at IBM as well. She holds a master's degree in communication from Fairfield University, is skilled in various leadership assessment tools. She also publishes a newsletter that delves into leadership insights and ideas called Leader Edge. And she has a book, a brand new book, which will be the focus of our conversation today. It is called Mind Knots: Understanding the Cognitive and Emotional Biases That Prevent Rational Leadership. And with that, enough of me. Lisa, welcome.
Thank you. That's quite the introduction, Kevin. I appreciate it. Good to be here. Thank you for your interest in the book and for the invitation to join your audience.
Well, I'm happy to have you, and I've been looking forward to this conversation. So I will tell you all that before I have someone on the show, if there's a book, which there almost always is, I have reviewed the book to decide if I'm going to ask the person to join me or not. And then I've typically read all or nearly all of the book before the time comes, but usually it's just in the days right before I do the show. But this particular book I received when I was working on the manuscript for my new book. And I actually read part of it to help me think about a couple of things I was working on. So I read some of it earlier, and then I read the rest of it in the last couple of days. So, Lisa, so glad to have you here. We're going to talk about mind knots or biases, I suppose. But before we go too much further, beyond that bio introduction that I shared with everybody, like tell us a little bit about how you end up, like when you were 5, you didn't say, I think I want to do executive search someday. Like how do you end up doing this work, and what sort of leads you to the book?
Yeah, no, you're right. When I was 5, no, I did not think about that.
Not
In
even when
fact,
you were 15, probably.
no. I mean, I grew up in a very sort of blue collar family and environment. I would say, my mom and dad probably didn't even know what CEO meant. I mean, that was sort of the level at which I started. But, I was different, and you grow up in an environment like that. It's sort of scripted. Everyone has a preconceived notion about how their daughter's going to grow up and what they should be doing and how the son's going to grow up. And, so for my brother, he was going to be the doctor or something. He, in fact, now is a scientist. And for me, I was supposed to get married and have children and raise a family, right? But my brain never worked like that. It just didn't. I always had an incredible curiosity and always wanted to learn, just insatiable for learning. So the script never really fit me, honestly. And I, paid for my education, went through, did all the stuff that you mentioned before. And here I am. And so I was extremely fortunate to end up doing what I do right now for a living, which I love. And it was all because I worked for a few years at a private equity environment for a leader, supporting this leader who was an executive search person prior. And he hired me to work with him to manage this portfolio of 14 companies with lots of leadership issues and challenges.
Sure.
I learned, right? And then he took me and hired me to work in a search firm that he then ran. And it just sort of took off from there. So I'm very lucky. This was by accident, but it's the best thing that's happened to me.
Well, I have found that while lucky things may happen, people make their own luck in terms of what they do when those things happen. So I want to ask you something. I don't want you to take it wrong by any means, but there's a part in the subtitle that I think is probably not often mentioned, or even this idea is not all that often mentioned in books these days. I sound like an old person when I say that, but it's the last 2 lines of the subtitle, which are rational leadership. So first of all, what do you mean by rational leadership? Because that wouldn't be the adjective a lot of people would use today. So let's make sure that everyone knows what you mean by that. And I know it was a conscious decision. So let's talk about that before we go any further.
Yeah. I mean, rational, by rational, I mean leadership decisions that are made with thinking, logical thinking, right? And not impulsive, not quick responses to a stimulus of any kind. Those are the things that fall by the wayside, right? Because of these biases, which I term mind knots. We're just loaded with lots of preconceived notions that sort of guide us, and they're in play every day. And they, as I say, they, control the decisions we make and the actions we take. And unless we become, first of all, just understand that they exist, level number 1 of awareness, 100%. And then learn to be tune into ourselves and sort of pay attention to patterns of decisions we make, outcomes, more importantly, our process for making those decisions, right? Which then have consequences in behavioral, however. that's really why I wrote the book. That's the core of it. And it is a leadership lens, right? So you mentioned that I, do a lot of these assessments and stuff in the course of my work. That's correct. But this is a leadership lens that I don't think many companies think about. And yet, at the root of most of what goes wrong.
You use that phrase when we were chatting before the show went live. You
Mhm.
use that phrase leadership lens, and I use that idea and that language too. And I think you're right. I would say that the discussion, both societally and in
Mhm.
leadership circles, about the idea of biases is far more prevalent now than it's ever been in my lifetime.
Now. Mhm.
But that doesn't mean that it's a lens that we're using very often with leaders or as leaders. And so I definitely want us to get there. But one more thing before we get there, because you said calling biases knots, and throughout the book you sort of use the metaphor of the knot and the rope and all of that stuff, sort of sailor types terms.
Yeah.
And before we get into some of these biases, I'm curious why that metaphor. How does that metaphor
Mhm.
inform us and help us look through this lens?
Right. Well, because if you think of a knot, right, it's very hard. It can be very hard to untangle. And knots, the book does have a nautical theme. I was trying to lighten the cognitive load of the topic. So,
I didn't know if
you
you
know,
were like some famous sailor in your spare time
no,
or something.
no, I do love the water and I do love boats, but no, I'm not a sailor. But it has a double meaning too, right? Because knots can tie us in place and tie us down, and if we don't know how to unravel them, there we stay. And yet, from a nautical perspective, knots can give you speed and move you forward. And so, the big sort of picture takeaway from the book is, how do you recognize the knots that are prominent in you? And my mind knots may not be my prominent mind knots may not be the same as yours, right? But I know what mine are, and so I won't let them tie me down. I've learned intervention strategies to move me forward, so you can flip them from what can be these anchors or tight woven knots to strategic assets. And that's the point in leadership, right? Because
Yeah.
there are three truths that I always say about psychological bias. Um, Number one is, it's a human condition. None of us are immune. Some people may think that they don't have as many biases as anybody else, but that is not true.
There's the bias, like right there. We've already got
That
it.
is
You've
the
just
bias.
identified
That
it,
is the
right?
bias. And so we are, there's a mosaic of these biases or mind knots that are usually at play. It's not even usually one that we have to worry about, it's many. So it's a human condition. Nobody's immune. They represent our mental lens, and there's no way to get around that. So you go back to the question you asked before in terms of leadership. Yes, a leader's mental lens means everything, because that is the lens through which you see the world, every situation, every person, every business challenge. So therein lies why it's so crucial to pay attention to this as an individual leader and from an organizational standpoint. Because what I also say in the book, you probably saw, is, as the leader goes, the organization goes. We all know that, right?
Yeah.
So biases are very pervasive, and many people will mirror behaviors, attitudes, emotions of a leader. So now, all of a sudden
I
you
would,
have a,
I would even say not many. Everybody does. Like
yeah,
maybe not as much as some more
right,
than others, but like
right.
people often say, Kevin, well, the best leaders are role models. I'm like, every leader's a role model. Like they're watching, right?
In one
They're
way or
watching,
another.
they're modeling, they're figuring out how the game is played on this team.
Exactly.
100%.
Exactly. 100%. So, that's the number two of a truth about these biases. And the third thing is, they can't be eliminated ever. We own them, they're part of us, we are wired. What we can do, though, is manage them, learn to recognize them and manage them. And that's really the whole point of the book. as you saw in every chapter, I break the chapter into 3 parts. The first part talks about the bias and what's like not good about it, all the negative
Yep.
consequences of it, with backed up with real stories, public stories that people will know. This middle of the chapter is sort of how to navigate them on an individual level through something I call the captain's compass. And the third is really the big takeaway is, you know what, guess what? These affect a whole organization, and they will. You can think it's just, within a leader. It's not. So the third section of our chapter is a systemic approach to how to manage these, and how to, I say it's like we've met the enemy and the enemy is us, right? So a lot of the strategies in the book have been designed to protect ourselves from ourselves and to protect organizations from ourselves by putting in very clear things in place.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. If you're just joining us, the book that that Lisa Tromba keeps telling you about is her new book called Mind Knots, Understanding the Cognitive and Emotional Biases that Prevent Rational Leadership. And so now I want to talk about some of these biases or biases. I'm not sure which is right. Maybe both are right. I've said both now in the last 15 minutes. So I want to start here. Like, there's a lot of them, and there's a lot in the book. There's no way we're going to get to all of them. And so, y'all, if you like this, you need to go get a copy of the book. We'll talk to you about that at the end. But I want to start with this question. Like, we know it's the human condition. Like, we all have them. We can't avoid them. We can't get rid of them. We understand that. You've just told us that. That's true. The question is, when you work with leaders, especially since you work a lot with executives, are there any that you find to be more prevalent than others, that you see showing up more, that we ought to really make sure we're sort of maybe almost hyper aware of?
Yeah. Yes, let me frame this. So there are over 200 that are legitimately recognized in the canons of behavioral finance. I wasn't going to write a book about 200 biases. So
thank you. You might not have been on the show if you'd written about 200.
No. So, I mean, I paid attention. Listen, what I do for a living, I'm an executive recruiter. I get, have discussions with organizations and leaders who are looking to hire other leaders. And sometimes it's because a leader's done exceptionally well and they're moving up. Sometimes it's because they're leaving the organization. But by and large, most of the time, it's because there's a problem. And so
they're leaving, but not of their own accord.
Yeah, right. And so, I am a great listener and I'm a great note taker, and I watch for patterns and I put things together. Over the course of like many discussions, many searches, solving these problems, it occurred to me like, okay, if clients describe the symptoms, well, so-and-so's doing this and that's, doing this and that's creating this. When I started to collect all those symptoms and bucket them, there were 8 themes that just kept coming up, which really are the roots of the problems. And what are they? They're mind knots, as I call them. And those 8 were egocentric.
And they're in the book. Shocking, right?
They're in the book.
Those 8 would be in the book.
Exactly. So the headlines of my 8 chapters became those 8 prominent problems that continued to surface that I was then engaged to solve through an executive search. Egocentric bias, I would say, is probably number 1 because, from my perspective, because I work with leaders at a vice president level through to the C-suite. These are positions of, people don't like the word power, but I mean that in terms of having the ability to advance a mission and an organization. Yes. So with that comes typically an ego, the varying intensities. But I would say that's probably the number 1 bias that manifests in problems, if not managed. Okay. Curse of knowledge is another, because again, as you get up the ladder, you can be very expert in something. And that presents itself in communication problems, understanding how to unravel your knowledge knot to be able to transfer the knowledge to a team or an organization or whatever. Control, another one, and the manifestation of, I mean, people think, oh, I got it, I can control this. And we can't control external factors. We can
influence them. We cannot control
we
them.
can influence them, and we could trick ourselves into thinking we have that control. We do not have that control. So that's a big one. And that manifests in micromanagement, trying to control people like puppets, and big issues there, big problems. Conformity bias, another. And I treat it in the book for what it is in terms of, we know what conformity means. But, with all these biases, by the way, I look at them as where's the risk and where's the treasure, because they do have redeeming qualities that are associated with them. Yep. Conformity is one of them. So conforming in the context of group decision making, not a good thing, right? That's groupthink. Those decisions generally are never good. Conforming to a purpose of an organization, a mission, a higher purpose, that's a good thing. You need people in the company that are on board with that mission. So I make that distinction. The others are optimism bias. Again, huge asset to leaders, but comes with huge risk too. Belief bias, same thing, tied to certain beliefs that, lead us to ignore information, other people, risks, the whole thing. Intuition, one of my favorites. That, I probably don't have to say a lot about that. And I have a high intuition bias, but I now know and have learned that got to pair it with logical reasoning, right?
Listen, you have an intuition bias, and you wrote a book that has in the subtitle the words rational leadership, yes. Right? Which means that you're aware of it. You overcame it at that level, because we can start to think about these in some ways as tensions, right? The tensions between them, and you've done something else in the book around these to help us think about how do we mitigate and how do we navigate around them and all of those sorts of things. But you can start to see how these become tensions, and certainly that idea of almost like knowledge versus intuition can kind of be on opposite ends, and we might lean one way or the other. I really want to. You identified most of the eight. You talked at least a minute about them. But there's a couple of them I want us to talk a little bit more about, and I want to start with. And you said it here. You said the control bias, but in the book you call it the illusion of control bias, which is what I love about it, because it is an illusion, right? Even though we may have, as a senior leader, have a lot of power, right? We really don't have control. We think we do. We like to act as if we do, and yet it's an illusion. So, talk about that one in terms of how. Like, we're talking to all the people that are watching us now, that are listening to us anytime in the future. Like, how might they, let me just start here and say, here's my observation. It's easy to see all these in somebody else. Like, if you read Lisa's book, oh, yep, that person, yep, that person, yep, that person.
That's right.
But that's not what we need to be thinking about here. I mean, other than as an example, and of course you do that in the book, but we need to turn the mirror around. Yeah. So my question is on the illusion of control bias, specifically, what might we be seeing or noticing in our world, in our work, in our leadership that might help us see that, in fact, we have that bias?
Yeah. So from an individual perspective, it's going to show up, because you're going to have people who generally will probably be micromanaged. That's a very rippling effect in all bad directions. So that affects morale, right? It affects, outcomes, productivity. It affects teamwork, everything. It's disabling. Let's just say that micromanagement is disabling. So
we can we say then in channeling our best Jeff Foxworthy, if people call you a micromanager, you might have the illusion of control bias.
Yeah. I say biases leave clues, right? You just have to know, you have to notice them, right? You can notice them if you become aware and you develop and you become sensitive and kind of tune into yourself. But you know what? Other people will tell you in one way or another. It'll show up on a 360 review. It'll show up because people will leave the company. There will be clues. And the question is to get past those symptoms that I was talking about earlier and get to the root cause. And oftentimes it's because of the way someone's brain is wired. It's because of their mind knot that and keeps them in a scripted way of responding or leading or managing instead of paying attention to what the clues that are all around them, that maybe it's not really making them the most effective leader.
So now you've said this several times. I said this in the introduction as well.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of we've got to become aware of them.
Yeah.
What? So I asked you that very specifically about the illusion of control. But beyond that, like, what are some ways
Mm-hmm.
that we can become more aware? Because all the research says that most people think they're self-aware, and none of us really are none of us are as self-aware as we think we are.
Yeah.
Like, how can we become more, especially as it relates to these biases? Because these biases are blind spots until we're aware of them. So what's 2 or 3 pieces of advice that you could give us to help us build awareness across any or all of them?
Yeah, right. So at first, it starts with you have to have an interest in wanting to be self-aware, right? Self-awareness is like the main thing in emotional intelligence. You can't make much progress in many directions unless you really focus on that first. So how do people?
If you have an egocentric bias, you might not be interested. Just saying, right?
Usually not. But the higher the level of someone's emotional intelligence, the more they will perhaps consider that they are not the ones with all the answers, right? And, here's how I frame it for my egocentric leaders, right? There's a huge need for recognition, status, all of those things, the fame and fortune stuff.
Oh, I'm afraid we lost Lisa. She froze, and now we don't have her anymore.
There you are. Okay, we're
she's
back.
back. So we lost you at the word
Egocentric. Right. So fame and fortune, all that, like that's a huge driver for an egocentric person. So my response to people where I see that, and I'm trying to coach them through it and just open their mind to consider that maybe this is getting in their way. I sort of position it as, listen, fame and fortune is like an individual achievement, and it's, can be short-lived. Legacy, on the other hand, is enriching more than the leader. It's enriching, theoretically, an organization and maybe beyond the business ecosystem. Right. So if you are on the mission and thinking broader than self-driven interests to enrichment of others and an entire organization, ecosystem, et cetera, now you're building a legacy. And so that resonates, because now you're flipping like my individual fame to, wow, if I can enrich a bigger group population, that's pretty special.
That can still feed that ego, but in a more outwardly valuable way. So in terms of back to how we build awareness, I sort of took you off track there.
Yep.
So we have to be interested in building our self-awareness. What else do we need to do?
Yeah. So there are things that do happen. There are tools. So assessment tools really help somebody, because it's like putting a great big magnifying glass right on you, right? These are objective tools. I'm not here to say like 100%, but what they are great at is indicators, and they provide us with the right questions to ask somebody to get to what we need to work on. So that's a huge tool in awareness, self-awareness, listening to other people, getting perspectives, critical, in leadership, critical to, from a leadership team standpoint, that is a non-negotiable. And as you pointed out, and that is the truth, it's hard for us to notice these biases in ourselves, but we can very readily notice them in other people typically. So when people are pointing something out or have something to say, listen, just listen and consider that maybe there's a possibility, there's like an ounce of truth in there that you can work with.
Especially if you hear it 716 times, everybody.
Yeah.
Like if one person says you're micromanaging, that could be there's a disconnect between your style and theirs. Yeah. But if you keep hearing it,
right,
it's, you said it earlier, biases leave clues. The clue gets stronger with every time the feedback gets repeated.
Exactly. Or, you can have a case where there's, a CEO who perhaps grew up in the finance track, was a CFO, or grew up in the market and was a CMO before they achieved the CEO. If they can't step out of that very focused expert role, they tend to micromanage those functions. Right.
Because
that's awareness, right? When all of a sudden, things aren't moving, the operating plan's not unfolding from the bigger picture of it, strategies aren't getting done because you're so focused on one thing that is not your job anymore, right?
100%.
Managing what you know.
And that's true at the C-suite, and that's also true with frontline leaders. That happens everywhere. We got to be really careful about that.
It's a big thing,
Lisa, you and I know, I knew this before we even met, that we could have a long conversation about this, but all good things must come to an end. So I need us to move into a couple of final questions that I like to ask my guests. And one of those is, what do you do for fun?
So I love to be outdoors, and I love to read, but all the time, anytime, anywhere, anytime. But I love the outdoors. So I'm a huge gardener. I love to nurture things. That's probably has a lot to do with what I do for a living. I love to nurture and grow and, create beautiful things. Those are probably my two big things. Yeah. I golf a little bit. Can't say I'm a great golfer, but we're working on it.
You're not a sailor. Like I thought I was going to hear sailor out of all this. So you did mention reading, and you did know that I was going to ask you that because you did your homework. So my question is, what are you reading right now?
Yeah. So right now I'm reading, the book is called Neuro Habits. And it's excellent because it ties in with exactly what I am all about and studying and talk about. It's written by Peter Hollins. And he goes into more about how to rewire your brain, right? Different ways that he suggests that people can do that. So it's very related to what I do. The other thing, that's more of a book I'm listening to. So when I told you I love to read, and I'll do it anyway, anyhow. In the car, when I'm walking, I'm on Audible, right? I'm listening to my audiobooks. The book that I'm actually reading and holding in my hand right now is Mastery by Robert Greene, which is an excellent book. I'm just sort of in the beginning stages of it and love it already. And a newer book that came out by Shane Parrish called Clear Thinking, which is fascinating. And I'll tell you why, because we talk about we're speaking the same language. I'm talking about it in terms of mind knots, a little bit of a different angle. He's talking about it from clear thinking. Right. We're headed in the same direction, and we have some of the same stories in the book too. It's remarkable.
I have not read Neuro Habits. I have read the other two. I recommend the other two both highly. So yep. I will recommend to all of you 4 books: Clear Thinking, Mastery, Neuro Habits, and Mind Knots. Tell us where we can connect with you, find the book. Where do you want to point people before we finish up?
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn is probably the easiest and the best way. And by the way, I did create a companion website for Mind Knots, which is mindknots.co. And that's another way to learn more about this. I really explore 40 plus biases on the website. because those are all mentioned in the book. They're not the core, but they're, this is a mosaic thing, right? Like I said from the beginning. So those biases matter. So that's a possibility. My Nuts is on Amazon, and my website for my executive search business is luisitromba.com.
And it's on the screen if you're watching. And if not, all of those links will be in the show notes for you all. So before we go, everybody, I have a question that I ask all of you every week, every episode. And it's the same 2 words every time. And the question is, now what? It's my favorite 2-word question because it's the question of action. So you've been hopefully enjoying this conversation and gotten some insights from it. There's been a tremendous amount of things that we've talked about that you could go out and apply right away. Maybe you've taken a leadership assessment and it's time to go back and look at it again. Maybe it's thinking about how you can be a little more interested in your own self-awareness. Maybe one of the biases we talked about is something that really hit home for you. And you want to pick up this book, or you want to in other ways research that bias to say, how is it impacting what I'm doing? My point here is whatever just listening will not get you the results that will really choosing to say, I'm going to take some action as a result. Hope that you will do that. Lisa, thanks so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Kevin. It was a pleasure to be here. And hopefully this has been helpful to everyone in the audience.
I'm confident that it has been, and I hope that if you have been with us before, you know this. But if you haven't, you now will know that we do this every week. If you're on the podcast, every week there's a new episode, and every week there's a new episode that's just me in about 4 or 5 minutes long as well. But every week, another interview, another conversation with an expert. I hope you'll come back and join us. Hope you'll like and subscribe. You know what to do and all that, because every week we'll be back with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.